Hello YouTube, Marcus here. So I wanted to take a moment here and do a little video on antibiotic-free meat, beef and poultry. And this is a lesson I learned as a very young chef way back, 1998 was the first time that I had actually learned this. And I was like, back then I was like, wow, this is pretty much a scam, antibiotic-free beef. And I want to share with you my experience back then as a young chef, a 24-year-old chef that was just getting into the world of conscious cooking, of understanding what's in our food. So a lot of restaurants, a lot of beef suppliers will tout they have antibiotic-free beef. And I just heard this the other day on a commercial for Subway, how they're serving antibiotic-free chicken. So I went on their website and I said, wow, the whole Subway chain is doing this. I said, let me investigate a little further here. And I go on their website and it turns out that they want to transition by 2025. The ad made it seem like right now their rotisserie chicken, or maybe their rotisserie chicken is and maybe the other chicken isn't. Maybe I don't go to Subway, so maybe there's a difference in the types of chicken they use. So they were talking about their rotisserie chicken. So I actually called Subway and I'm like, okay, so what's the deal here? Just tell me about this antibiotic-free thing. But first I went and looked on their website. So a lot of beef suppliers, poultry suppliers will say antibiotic-free. And here's what that really means. So as a young chef, the very first company that I was trying to buy antibiotic-free beef from, I was this chef at a country club in Colorado, actually Monument, Colorado, called Woodmore Country Club. And one of the members, the past vice president's wife, when I first came on board, she was, Marcus, can you get us antibiotic-free beef here? The last chef wouldn't get us any. And I was like, antibiotic-free beef? I'm like, I didn't know they put antibiotics in beef, right? I was a young chef. They don't teach us that stuff in culinary school. They don't teach us that kind of stuff anywhere. Or at least back then they didn't. And so I was like, huh. So I started asking my purveyors and they're like, oh, you want that? And one of the purveyors goes, I have an antibiotic-free beef. I'm like, wow. Out of all the purveyors we use, only one person has an antibiotic-free beef. So they brought the broker in. It was a company from Kansas, a beef company from Kansas. And I met with the guy who had worked out in the fields with the beef, and he was a broker, and so he handled all that, and he was very familiar with where the beef was coming from. So I said, explain to me this process. Like, how does this work? Like, this is all new to me, and I'm curious, and I have a lot of questions. And so he says to me, he goes, well, here's what happened. We buy beef on the open market. We put that beef into our feedlot. We hope the beef don't get sick, because we don't want, if the beef gets sick, then we have to give them antibiotics. And I said, what happens if you give them antibiotics? He goes, well, then we have to wean them off of antibiotics to bring them to processing, to bring them to the market. I said, you wean them off. So they've had antibiotics. He goes, well, yeah, they've had antibiotics. He goes, we're only selling an antibiotic-free beef. I'm like, but if it's antibiotic-free, how can it have, he goes, well, no. We test the carcasses, we test the beef. But what we do is we wean them off. So for the last 30 days of their life, they can't have antibiotics. Prior to that, they've had it. And I go, so what happens if they still have it in their system, the residues? He goes, well, we test the carcasses. I'm like, oh, wow, so you test it. So he goes, I'm like, so you test every carcass? Because I'm thinking, man, this is like expensive to test every carcass. He goes, we test 2 to 3 carcasses per 100 head of cattle. And if those 3 come back clean, the whole batch goes through as antibiotic-free. And I was like, so that's the definition of antibiotic-free? And he goes, yeah, that's the federal USDA definition of antibiotic-free beef. And I was like, wow, that pretty much sounds like a scam. So I go to the Subway website to see what their beef is with chicken, right? And see what's going on with that. And of course, on their website, they describe the term antibiotic-free as, what does antibiotic-free mean? By federal regulations, all chicken, turkey, and meat products served within the U.S. are free of antibiotics. This means that if an animal received antibiotics during its life to treat, control, or prevent disease, the antibiotic is no longer present at the time the meat is processed. And I was like, there you go. There's that definition again. We're going back 20 years later, 23 years later, and the industry is still using that definition for antibiotic-free meat. So now some producers, and of course, as you pay more for your products, you'll see that some producers have different policies. Some producers don't go by the federal definition. They go by what's called the never ever policy, which means the animals have never, ever, ever had antibiotics. So when you're buying beef for yourself, if you're concerned about antibiotics, if you're concerned about antibiotics in poultry or in turkeys, what you want to look for on the package would simply say, never, ever administered antibiotics. Never, ever administered hormones or whatever. That's the policy, never, ever. And of course, those prices do cost more because what happens with antibiotics, folks, not only do antibiotics are given to the cattle or the chickens so they don't get sick or so that you can treat them when they are sick, but antibiotics actually spur growth. So if somebody says, well, we don't do hormones, well, you're doing antibiotics. The antibiotics will make these animals grow as well too. So it's artificial growth. So some producers will say, well, like salmon producers are great for this. Well, we don't administer antibiotics. No, they don't administer them. They just constantly give them to them in the feed. So it's not like they're saying, well, you need to take it because you're sick in this salmon batch or this salmon pool or these salmon have this. Everything just gets it across the board because it's a slow dosage in their food. So that's also another tricky thing, administered or given. I mean, a lot of times it's just in the feed, they just give it to them. So you have to be very, very careful. Now, of course, our recommendation is to know where your beef's coming from, to know your producer. If you're buying locally, that's the best bet, right? Because then you can talk to the farmer at the farmer's market. You can talk to the producer. For us, in a commercial setting, it's kind of tough to buy all of our beef from, especially a busy restaurant, buy all of your beef from one farmer, because the farmer at some point has to scale. If you've scaled your restaurant to $2 million in sales or $3 million, you're a big restaurant. And we don't nearly do that, folks, but just giving an example. So if the farmer is supplying this particular restaurant, the farmer has to scale out too. And the farmer can only scale so much until they're doing more mass agriculture, and then it's, mass production, and then they're having to cut corners on certain things. So for example, like all of our ground beef comes from a small farm up in Dutchess County, Wheatley Farms. We buy about 2,500 pounds of ground beef from this farmer. When we first started dealing with Wheatley, they only made maybe 1,500 pounds a year, 1,200 pounds a year. So after we got a hold of his beef, I said, man, I love what you guys are doing. I love this beef. It's perfect for our restaurant. So the farmer goes, okay, I will up my production so I can keep up with your production. And that was the perfect marriage right there. We're like, wow, perfect. He was like, Marcus, you helped me out a lot because now I can raise 10 to 15 more head a year. And all they're doing is 30, 40 head a year. That's it. But as a restaurant grows, or this industry grows and the farmers grow, restaurants are taking strip steaks, filet mignons, they're taking endless amounts of this. So to approach one farmer that's doing even 200 head of cattle a year, 2 tenderloins per, 6 steaks per, 12 times, you're going to sell out of that in no time. So at some point you have to go over to bigger agricultural means to supply a restaurant. So what we do when we have to cross that border, because we use a lot of briskets, we use a ton of briskets. We typically go to a farm, like we're doing Joyce Farms right now, out of North Carolina, the Carolinas for our brisket. And what they do is we understand that they're the only ones that are growing the beef. They're not buying the beef from other people. They're not branding it, because a lot of beef that you see in the store is a brand. It might seem like a small farm, but in reality, it's just a brand that's buying from other small farms. And this happens with chicken processors as well, like Purdue. Purdue is massive and large, but Purdue is just buying their chicken from other people that have grown it out fully, and they're just bringing it in their possession the last couple days and processing it. That's it. So beef producers can do that as well. They bring it into their possession. They might finish it in their feedlot for another 30 days, 60 days, 9 days, and feed it out to their specifications. But other people were in charge of that cattle long before that. They're just a consolidator, right? But then they put a label on it like Green Pasture Farm, or Pineland Farms is famous for this. Pineland Farms, which is a farm, started out as one farm in Maine, hormone-free, antibiotic-free beef, really good. They're so large now at the scale that they have contracted farms from Maine to Virginia to the Mississippi River. They have 500 small family farms they're buying from. What happens there is then all their beef comes to 1 or 2 facilities. They're finished at the facilities, and they put the Pineland Farms logo on it. So it's like Pineland Farms, this farm out of Maine. And so it's very misleading, because even a lot of chefs think that they're serving one beef, one farm out of Maine, and that's not the case at all. You can look at the box and say, wow, if the farm's in Maine, why are they processing this in Maryland or Western Pennsylvania? So you can see by the numbers on the actual case where it's processed, the processing plant. So one of our first questions that we ask everybody who comes in is, well, I have this kind of beef. How many head of beef are processed a week? And this gives us a really good clue to how large that company is. So if a company is doing 50 head of beef a week, 100, they're a very small company. Most big companies like IBP, Montfort, Excel, the big players in the game, do 400 animals an hour. Okay, that's what they need to do to turn a profit and make money. And there's a very slim margins in there, and they're doing that many an hour. So if you're buying from somebody, if you know, that's the first. And when I ask these questions, a lot of salespeople say to me, "Man, you're asking questions like that no other chef has ever asked before." I'm like, because I want to make sure I know what I'm buying. I want to make sure I know what the product is, and if I were to buy it. Like there's believe it or not, a product in Restaurant Depot, Myers Natural Beef. Myers is a consolidator. I don't buy their beef often at all, but sometimes when I'm in a pinch or something, I have to buy. But it's if I buy it twice a year, 3 times a year, that's it. And maybe it's for a party or something. So the Myers, I looked at this and I said, wow, this is kind of a small brand, I think. And I go to do further research to find out they're only doing 1,500 head a week. If you're doing 1,500 head a week and you're distributing in Restaurant Depot throughout the Northeast, and you're only doing 1,500 head of cattle a week, you're a small company still. You're a very small company considering how far your network goes out. So these are things that I judge when I buy beef. But as a consumer, you don't need that much beef. You can go right to the farmer's market. You can go contract right out to a local farm and buy a quarter cattle, half cattle, and have them cut it to your exact specifications. And you get these size, 8-ounce filet mignon steaks or 4-ounce filet mignon steaks, 12-ounce ribeyes. You can get some porterhouses. You can get some ground beef. You can get some stew meat. You can get all these different, some roasts, some brisket. You get all these different cuts and have this literally in your freezer. And understand that this product has never, ever, ever received hormones or antibiotics. Has been on one farm its whole life. The farmer's taking care of it. Now, here's one thing: when cattle say never, ever given hormones and antibiotics, for cattle to cross state lines, which happens a lot of times, they get a full round of vaccinations when they're born. All right, so they're fully vaccinated, which if you're concerned about vaccines, then of course that's a medicine that's in it that might, have, who knows? I'm not going to get the vaccines in this video, but if you're concerned about it, they're vaccinated. Very, very few cattle farmers do not vaccinate. And again, if it crosses state lines, they want them vaccinated, so they can't cross. One of the problems with beef production now is that if you're a small farmer, if you're a very small farmer, if you're doing 5 head of beef, you still have to ship the live cattle out somewhere, and they have to get then processed at a facility that might be a 2-hour ride or maybe a 8-hour ride, because there's not so many small independent processors left that are USDA certified if they're going to go sell to the market. They can do state certification if they're at a very low amount, but once they reach that threshold of the dollar amount, they have to switch to a USDA facility, especially if I'm buying beef. The restaurant has to be a USDA facility. So they're literally stuck for driving their cattle for 4 hours, letting them sit there for a day, mixing in with other cattle if there's diseases with other cattle, whatever's happening, mix in with the breed. Everything's segregated and segregated out so they know it's their cattle, but still, they're in with other cattle in these holding lots. Now, when I was in Colorado, I was very good friends with Frank, who owned GNC Meatpacking, and I got to see the ins and outs of all of this type of cattle. The small farmers bringing in, larger farmers bringing in, him packaging his own brand, the farmers packaging their own brand with their labels. So I got to, at a really young age, at 24, 25 years old, I got to see the ins and outs of the beef industry. And living in Colorado, when you drive past Montfort, up near Denver, up near Greeley, 30 miles away, you smell that feedlot. And in a 5-mile square feedlot, there's literally 250,000 animals sitting in there. And when you get to see something like that, you're like, oh my gosh, wow, this is like what the beef industry has come to, and this is not what, for me, cooking is. Cooking is more like what Frank's doing at GNC Packing, where he's doing a very small number of animals a day. And Frank, by the way, is actually certified from Whole Foods, which is another higher standard that these processors have to answer to, because they're very, very strict, Whole Foods, believe it or not, on the proper methods of proper treatment and like that. So that's one good thing that Whole Foods has done. They've set some really strict guidelines for the beef processors. So it's not a horrific scene like some of those big places are. And it's regulated too, or monitored, very monitored from the Whole Foods inspectors. They walk in, they give them 100 rounds, you have 100 cattle, and that's what you're expected to do. And if you don't, if you can't get 100 rounds for 100 animals, there's a problem. Whole Foods does not want the beef anymore because they understand you're being careless in the processing plants. So that's a really good thing that Whole Foods has done. And I got to see that firsthand as well in Frank's operation when we were visiting him back in 2010, 2011. So folks, that's a roundup on beef and poultry. Remember, look for a never, ever, ever product when it comes to antibiotics or hormones, antibiotics. It'll say never, ever, ever. If it's not a never, ever product, it means they've had antibiotics and then they've simply, I wonder if I can pop this up, the exact definition here in our, I can, let's see. I'm gonna pop up a comment in our Facebook right now of what it means to be antibiotic free. And there you go. So there's the exact definition of what antibiotic free means. And folks, small producers can be doing this too. You might think something is a small producer and they could be like buying their chickens from, I don't know, Pennsylvania, bringing it to their farm and finishing it. The chickens could have had stuff prior to them arriving to the farm, but that farmer, the finishers, chose not to keep administering anything. So just ask questions, because a lot of people who are finishing the product aren't the ones that, like in the beef world. Small farms, yes, but some of those other guys, they're not in the calving business, so they're not there calving, which means getting the cows pregnant and giving birth. It's too much work for them. They'd rather just buy from their known source or the auction or somewhere that actually has a reliable source, a so-called reliable source of cattle. And they might buy them at 3 months old, 6 months old, 9 months old, and they bring them onto their farm and finish them off. Or the guy who's calving them was like, I don't know how to market beef. I just know how to make a bunch of cows pregnant and give birth to them. And I've actually been on the farm before. I was with a gentleman, the book Fast Food Nation, which was written back in 97, 98. The guy who hung himself in the book, if you've read that book, the guy who hung himself, we ended up working very closely with his brother Jay, very closely. And I was actually out in the fields with Jay, and he's a calver. He doesn't finish his beef. He doesn't sell his beef. He sends it to people that then buy his beef. And I'm out in the pickup truck with him. I'll never forget this. I'm out in the pickup truck with him, and the cows are giving birth out in the field. There's one cow that's having a problem. I don't know the cow's having a problem. So Jay's driving very slowly. Jay opens the truck door. While this truck is moving, he goes, "Marcus, take over the truck. Take over the truck, grab the steering wheel and take over the truck." And he leaps out of the truck and goes and wrestles down this mother cow who's having problems giving birth. And he sits there and helps the cow give birth. And I get in the driver's seat, slide over because it's the bench seat, put the brakes on, stop this thing, and watch him do this. I'm like, "Jay, what did you just do?" He's like, "She was having problems giving birth." And and I had to get out here in the truck. I saw what was happening when I was out here, and I had to help her give birth. I was like, whoa, like, he goes, so calving is a totally different process than finishing beef. And some farmers don't do both. Some do both, but some don't do both. And so Jay puts his cattle out on grass, feeds them for 3 months, and then sends them to a mid-feeder. The mid-feeder keeps them on grass, keeps them out there until they're 9, 10, 12 months old. And then that person ships it off to a finisher, which then sticks in a feedlot. And then from that feedlot is where they administer all the growth stimulants, all the grains, all the leftover pastries, all the other kind of stuff, if they're doing that kind of stuff in that feedlot. But you can look at some of the most famous brands in America, like Painted Hills Beef, which is extremely boutique-y beef from the Northwest. And you go on their website, and it'll tell you right on their website, they buy the stuff, and they put it in a consolidated feedlot. And this stuff, chefs pay premiums for this. A lot of chefs have no clue that they're not buying from the farm. They're buying from a consolidator. They're not buying from somebody like Jay, who's out there calving beef and raising the beef and finishing it to the end. That's not the case. So I was really grateful to learn a lot about the beef production in Colorado way back when I was young and experience all this kind of stuff. So I just like to share my knowledge on all this, and I figured that if you knew what antibiotic free really meant, you'd probably ask better questions. So if this was a help for you, this video, please hit the like button. Please share it on Facebook, share it on YouTube, wherever you're watching it at. Please share it. I'd appreciate that. And that's it, folks. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. And until the next video.